A young woman's car breaks down on a dark, lonely road. There is no help. She's now stranded and vulnerable. So she realizes her only option is to get out of the car and figure out what's wrong. But she's not alone. And the worst part, what happens next starts her fight for survival. You won't want to miss this one. In 2014, a young woman named Rhonda was driving through the back roads of Missouri on a beautiful, crisp autumn evening. She was heading to pick up her husband from his mother's house, which is about an hour away from where they lived. And Rhonda was very familiar with the roads, having made this trip many times prior, but tonight there was something different. Something was just off and she couldn't put her finger on it. And as she turned onto a gravel road, Rhonda couldn't help but notice how dark everything had become. The woods loomed on one side while a creek and a commercial farm stretched out on the other. Rhonda squinted, trying to see further ahead in the dim moonlight, and the headlights of her old truck barely illuminated the narrow road that winded through the trees. Now suddenly, Rhonda's truck sputtered and coughed, and she glanced down at the gauges and her heart sank. The fuel gauge read empty. How could that be? Because she had just filled up the tank before leaving town. The engine died, and she coasted to a stop on the shoulder. As it turns out, her vehicle wasn't actually out of gas. There was just some sort of mechanical malfunction. And so she grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and stepped out into the chilly night air. And so she popped the hood to take a look, and she heard this twig snap in the woods nearby, making her jump immediately. Now she swung the flashlight beam towards the trees and thought she saw something, this dark gray figure that darted across the road from the creek side. And it happened so fast that she couldn't make out many details, but one thing stood out: the tail. And so she's squinting, trying to make sense of what she just saw. I mean, the tail looked like it belonged to a dog, but the rest of it didn't quite fit. Now, at this point, her heart is racing, and she's thinking, maybe it's someone's pet that got loose. I should check it out. The woods just seemed to close around her, and every little sound made her jump. And as if on cue, another car approached. And as you can imagine, she hoped they would stop and ask if she needed help, but the car kept going, leaving her alone again. And now she's starting to panic. All those horror movies she'd watched over the years began playing in her head. The ones where unsuspecting victims investigate a strange noise in the woods. Those ones. And so she quickly decided that maybe this wasn't a good idea after all. And after taking a deep breath, just trying to calm her nerves, she needed to focus on getting back on the road. And as she leaned in under the hood for a closer look, she hears this low growl behind her. And at this point, she hurries back to her vehicle. She fumbled for the door handle of her truck, but her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't get a grip. And now, her imagination is just running wild with what this could have been. Was it just a dog or something else entirely? And she is trying to steady her hands the best she can. She takes a deep breath, tries the key again, but still nothing. And at this point, the growling sound was getting closer, and she could hear the crunching of leaves. Now suddenly, a dark shape emerges from the woods, its eyes sort of glinting with what little moonlight there was. At this point, Rhonda screams as whatever this is steps into the beam of her flashlight. The way she could describe it was this massive, wolf-like animal, but something was really off. Its fur was a sickly gray, and its snout was elongated, similar to a crocodile's. This thing snarled at her and revealed a set of jagged teeth that looked like they could easily tear through flesh. At this point, she's glancing around looking for anything she could use as a weapon. And as this happened, she realized a second pair of eyes was approaching the truck from behind. She only noticed this because she saw movement from the rearview mirror. And just as Rhonda was about to scream, a blinding light suddenly flooded the road. A large pickup truck came barreling down, going way faster than the speed limit. And for those few seconds, she took her chance. She kept trying the engine over and over, and like a miracle from heaven, it roared to life. Without taking another second, she threw it into drive and peeled out of there so fast. She had just narrowly avoided something dangerous. Well, she gets back home, and her husband notices how pale and out of breath she is. Something is clearly off about her. After settling down, she tells her husband and mother-in-law about the incident. And of course, they laugh it off. A donkey with a dog's tail? Come on, Rhonda, they would tease her. But Rhonda knows what she saw, even if she can't quite explain it. And you know what? This wasn't Rhonda's only brush with the unexplained. She had another strange experience during a camping trip in Merrimack Springs Caverns in Missouri, also in a national forest. And as it happens, only a few years later, she found herself face to face with another mystery. Rhonda and her husband had decided to take a little getaway with some friends to escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life. And they're all excited, packing up their gear, ready for some good old-fashioned outdoor fun. And as they arrived at the campsite, the first day went by without a hitch. They hiked and explored the caverns, they sat around the campfire. It was everything a camping trip should be. But then night fell, and things started to get weird. In the dead of night, Rhonda stirred, urgently needing to relieve herself. She struggled in the darkness, searching for her flashlight without disturbing her husband. Finally, she unzipped the tent and stepped into the chilly air. The campsite was quiet for the most part, but there were a few owls in the distance, and as she made her way to the campground bathroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And the air felt really heavy, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. And so with this, she quickened her pace. Her flashlight beam is bobbing erratically in front of her, and it's like the shadows seem to move, and every twig is just snapping under her feet, making her jump. And she's trying to tell herself to get a grip. It's just your imagination. But then, what happened next feels like something straight out of the Twilight Zone. She finished up in the bathroom and began heading back to her tent. And that's when she noticed it. I say it because we don't know what it was. In the middle of the campground was a patch of absolute darkness. It was like a void, darker than the night sky, and seemed to be moving. And she's watching this thinking, this can't be real, I have to be dreaming. But no matter how often she blinked or rubbed her eyes, that patch of darkness was still there. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The campground had returned to normal as if nothing happened, and so all she could do was just sit there and momentarily process her thoughts. What was it she had just seen? I mean, she surely saw something there that wasn't supposed to be. This couldn't have been a trick of the light, because the only light source was her flashlight and the moon. And even in her gut, she could sense that something was wrong. This was the same instinct that told her she was in trouble years back when she had her experience. She raced back to the tent, zipped it up as tight as she could behind her, and all she could do was just lay there wide awake. In her mind, she drew parallels to that night and what happened on that gravel road. Now eventually, Rhonda was able to fall asleep from sheer exhaustion. All morning long, as she sat there with her husband while he made coffee, she just became lost in the fire, deciding whether to share her experience with him. Like last time, she knew how he'd most likely treat it, and she was in no mood to repeat rejection like that. Now, fortunately for Rhonda, the rest of the trip went without any incidents. Still, she couldn't help but feel that these events were somehow interlinked. Interestingly, the area where Rhonda had her experience was so close to the Mark Twain National Forest. For those of you newer to this kind of content, there are many strange missing person cases, sightings, experiences of things people can't explain, and more within national forests. It's become this phenomenon, and no one can figure it out. Moreover, Merrimack Caverns, which are also at the northern tip of the Mark Twain National Forest, has a history and legends of a paranormal nature. Visitors and staff have reported various paranormal experiences, including ghostly apparitions and strange, unexplained noises, which have been attributed to the spirits of outlaws and Native Americans who may have used the caverns as a refuge. Unfortunately, despite the overwhelming accounts from staff and visitors alike in Mark Twain, without concrete evidence, these will just remain stories. The strange experiences Rhonda and others had will remain unexplained. On July 5th, 2022, Mark had gotten up for the day just like any other day. He was excited because on this day, he was going to go fishing in one of the most beautiful spots he knew. And in fact, often to and from work, he would pass the Riverview Access Conservation Area located in Cuba, Missouri. However, it would be a couple months before he could go fishing there himself. Now, after going there several times, he quickly fell in love with the spot. He was able to catch a lot of fish, and the area in particular was very quiet. It was very scenic, perfect for getting away from your busy lifestyle and just relaxing. And on this day, he could not wait to get there. And so, after loading all of his equipment in his truck and arriving there late in the afternoon, he was overjoyed that he didn't have any competition. In fact, he was the only one there. So he cast his line in the water and just began enjoying himself. The evening was quiet, it was calm, and after some time, the sun had gone down and it was getting dark. Now, because of this is in the middle of summer, it didn't get dark till around 8:30 or so, and in his head, he starts thinking that he will start to wrap things up pretty soon. I mean, he's got to head back home and get some sleep for work. Now, keep in mind that at this point, he's lost in thought, and there has not been a peep around him at all. And suddenly, out of the brush comes this large rock flying through the tree line on the opposite bank and then lands in the water, making a huge splash. Immediately, Mark is taken aback because he realized that whoever threw this rock had to have been incredibly strong. We're talking 6'3", 350 pounds, but even a guy of that size and weight, well, there's just no way you could throw a rock that large that far. And immediately, Mark just gets this sour feeling in his stomach, and he's thinking that whoever threw that rock, he doesn't want anything to do with them. Obviously, like any of us would. He was very confused and he didn't immediately retreat. And so he stood there for a moment thinking he would be able to see the person responsible moving in the tree line. And after a few minutes rolled by, he wasn't able to see anything, and the situation just grew weirder and weirder. And at this point, he decided it was probably time to leave considering the circumstances. The hair on the back of his neck started standing up, and he got this overwhelming feeling that he was being watched. And he started reeling in his line, trying to keep an eye on the bushes behind him simultaneously. The rustling had stopped, but the silence felt even more unnerving. And Mark began thinking that maybe he was just being paranoid, maybe it was nothing. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Now, to give more context, he clearly saw the rock as it was still in the air, falling into the water, and described it as roughly the size of a bowling ball. Now, there's no way this could have rolled off a cliff since there are no high bluffs behind where this happened. More so, it was not like a flight path where it was thrown sideways. It was thrown up and shot down into the water. This means that whoever had enough strength to do this had to have been incredibly large and strong. Now, like Rhondas Story, Mark also had this experience in the Mark Twain National Forest. This area happens to be a hotbed of Bigfoot sightings, and many have described similar behaviors with other Bigfoot sightings and experiences like throwing rocks and large branches. Obviously, there's no way to say exactly what Mark experienced, but it was certainly weird, and whoever or whatever was on the opposite bank that day remains a mystery. This last story has a twist you won't expect. It's pretty wild. More disturbingly, what the witness experienced, well, she's not alone. There are many others like her. In August of 1980, Willow and her husband had been looking forward to their annual camping trip in northern Minnesota for months. And so they packed up their old station wagon with all the essentials, tents, sleeping bags, and enough canned beans to last a week. Now, this family spent much time outdoors, so they were very prepared, or at least Willow was. But her husband, Tom, was more of a city slicker who had only recently been converted to the joys of roughness in the wilderness. But that wasn't going to stop her from enjoying a much-needed vacation. And so after packing everything up, they headed out and began driving to the farthest reaches, which were really densely wooded. Now, if any of you have been out on some of these roads, a lot of them become windy at points and just curve back and forth. And as Tom came around a bend in the road, he suddenly had to slam on his brakes because there in the middle of the road was this massive fallen tree that blocked their path. Now, Tom turned off the engine and he just kind of sighed because he's wondering what they're going to do. And so, Willow peered out from the windshield and she could see that this was a massive oak that was sprawled across the road. And she glanced at the steep embankments on either side. It was clear there would be no going around this. And so she told her husband, look, we're going to have to take care of this if we want to get by. And so both of them get out of the car, they go to the back, and they grab the rope, they grab the hatchet, and they know it's going to take them a while, but they don't really have a choice. They're going to do the best they can to just try and hack it apart and do what they can to drag it out of the road. And as soon as they started to work on moving this tree, you could see the differences in their approach. Willow grabbed the hatchet from the back and she just began hacking away at some of the smaller branches. And she just kept thinking that this isn't so bad, we'll have this cleared in no time. But Tom was a little more overwhelmed. And as they worked, the sun began to dip in the sky, the woods around them grew darker, and the forest sounds became more pronounced. And Tom was starting to get a little nervous. He just kept glancing around, half expecting some wild animal to come charging out of the bushes. But Willow just kept working away, humming to herself as she cleared the branches, and then just as they were about to start on the main trunk, they heard something. It was this low rumble coming from somewhere down the road behind them. It had this metal scraping noise, but was hard to pinpoint. Either way, they ignored it the best they could, and they just kept hacking away. And they were deep in the woods, miles away from any town or civilization. So hearing any kind of mechanical sound out here was definitely not normal. And as they were finishing up the tree, the noise continued to crescendo and would die down again. Then it would crescendo again and die down again. Now, obviously, this was very strange. And then, just as they were about to see what was making all that racket, the noise just suddenly stopped altogether. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The forest went dead quiet. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees. There was nothing. And now Tom's really starting to freak out. He's looking at Willow with wide eyes, probably thinking they should hightail it out of there, but Willow, she's got this determined look on her face. She's not about to let some weird noise ruin their vacation. Finally, after getting the tree out of the way, they moved back towards the car and headed to their favorite camping spot, which wasn't far at this point. And as they drove the last few miles to the campsite, this silence just hung between them. And Tom kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following them. Willow tried her best to reassure him, reminding him that they were in the middle of nowhere and it was probably just some old logging equipment or something. But even in her gut, she knew that she was probably wrong. Now, once they arrived at the familiar clearing where they always set up camp, the tall pines kind of gave them this comforting feeling. Willow busied herself by unpacking the gear and setting up the tent while Tom had a fire. And the crackling of the flames and the routine of camp chores did help ease their nerves, and as darkness fell, they huddled close to the fire, sipping on hot coffee and trying to shake off the chill that had settled over them. A chill that had little to do with the cool night air. The forest around them was still unnaturally devoid of any usual nighttime sounds, like crickets or owls. But folks, the strangest was yet to come. Tom suddenly froze as they were getting ready to turn in for the night, and he's thinking, what was that? Did I just see something moving in the trees? But he didn't want to alarm Willow, so he kept it to himself. And then, just as they were zipping up the tent, he heard that same noise again. The rumbling sound from earlier, but this time, it seemed closer. Tom turned to Willow and realized she saw it too because she's got this worried look on her face, and they're both thinking the same thing. Maybe we should have listened to our gut and headed home when we had the chance. But it was too late for that now. They were miles away from anywhere, so they did the only thing they could do, which is hunker down in their tent, hoping to wait out whatever was out there. Now, as the night wore on, the strange noises continued. Sometimes it sounded like metal scraping against metal, and other times it was like these low, indiscernible noises they couldn't make. Either way, it really creeped them both out, but they had put all the effort into coming out this way to stay as long as possible. There was no way Willow was going to just up and leave and head back home. Now eventually, morning came, and after making breakfast together, the sounds of the forest seemed to return. In fact, everything felt relatively normal compared to the previous day. It was an odd turn of events, but Willow and her husband were more than thrilled about it. They could finally enjoy their trip. They did their best to sit around the camp most of the morning and just relax. Well, as noon rolls around, Willow wants to go for a walk in the woods. So she tells Tom that she thinks now would be a great time before it gets too hot in the afternoon. The couple began walking down a nearby unmarked trail. Believe it or not, this was the most at peace they had been since the start. The two ventured further until they reached this small lake where Willow decided to rest on a large rock nearby. And as Willow sat on that rock, she was drawn to something strange moving in the sky above. This object just hovering there. And Willow kept thinking, what on earth am I looking at? And so she called out to Tom, who was a little way down the shoreline, skipping rocks across the lake, and he jogs over, expecting Willow to show him some interesting plant or a deer across the lake. But when he saw the look on her face, he knew something was up. And now, as Willow pointed to the sky, his jaw dropped. The object, whatever it was metallic and disc-shaped, catching the sunlight as it moved. It was unlike anything either of them had ever seen before, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it shot straight up into the sky and vanished. Tom and Willow stood there just staring at the empty sky, trying to process. Like the night before, the forest around them had gone quiet, and they're both just standing there trying to wrap their heads around it. And now they're both thinking the same thing. Holy crap, that was a UFO. So Willow turned to Tom and she's like, we need to head back to camp now. It's not safe out here. And of course, she didn't have to tell him twice. He quickly started gathering their things, probably thinking about how nice their tent would be at this point, and they made their way back to the woods, and every snapping twig and rustling leaf had them on edge. And just as they thought things couldn't get any creepier, they kept hearing that low rumbling sound. Except this time, it wasn't coming from behind them or to the left or right. It seemed like it was coming from all around, like there was no discernible source. And like before, it would just randomly stop altogether. Both of them were growing incredibly frightened, as you can imagine, and once they got back to camp, they entertained the idea of camping in a different section of woods, miles away from this place, but the effort of unloading and repacking just didn't matter anymore. They realized something when they returned to their campsite as well, which was no more than 10 minutes away from where they saw this strange disc. They had somehow lost 2 hours of time. It should have been impossible considering they weren't gone for more than 30 minutes. That was enough of a signal for them to bail out of that spot, and they were gone. They spent the rest of their camping vacation miles and miles closer to civilization, but for some reason, that camping trip left Willow with a deeply traumatic experience. Now, for years, she couldn't really understand why, because she never felt like she could remember anything specific that traumatized her. But the feelings lingered. It was very strange and hard to explain. Well, after years of trying to understand it, Willow would undergo hypnosis. And folks, this is where the twist comes into play. During hypnosis, she was able to recall a string of events that took place during her camping trip, which she couldn't initially remember. It's almost as if these events were so traumatic for her that her memory wouldn't allow her to access them. She recalled that she could hear her name being called out while staring at this disc in the sky, and she witnessed what she would describe as a group of humanoids. They were thin, 5'6" tall, wearing these strange one-piece jumpsuits, and instantly she was taken in and explained to her by them that they wanted to impregnate her with a hybrid fetus. Unfortunately for these beings, she had her fallopian tubes tied, and this made them very angry, and so she was instantly sent back to the rock she was sitting on. All communication occurred telepathically, and interestingly, she noticed an odd symbol they wore on their belts, a winged serpent. Unfortunately, not much else is known about these beings, who they were, what they wanted and why, or any of the events leading up to this. However, Brad Steiger reported this case in his book UFO Universe in September of 1998. All of it remains a mystery. And because you guys made it this far into the video, I want you all to comment below, "I'm not scared of camping," so that way I know who made it to the end of the video and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.